We're going to begin this evening with a closer look at one of this country's most well-known media outlets, National Public Radio. For years and years, NPR news and programs have been funded in part by the government and in part by listeners, those who call in and pledge money, and those who give big donations as well. But more and more recently, it's common to hear the names of sponsors mentioned on NPR. And it turns out there are actually certain programs sponsored entirely by one company. And that may or may not influence the content of the program. So we're going to look tonight at the financial program Planet Money, hosted by Adam Davidson. When you click to listen, you're likely to hear this.
Support for Planet Money comes from Ally Bank. NPR keeps people in the know, so does Ally. Customers can talk to a real person any time of day or night. Learn more at allybank.com.
So who exactly is Ally Bank? Well, it turns out, among other things, the company has spent quite a bit of money lobbying against the creation of what is now the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So maybe it will come at no surprise then that when Planet Money host Adam Davidson had the head of the CFPB, Elizabeth Warren, on for an interview, things got a little heated. Take a listen.
This crisis will not be over until the American family begins to recover. This crisis does not exist independently.
Your crisis.
No, it is not my crisis. That is America's crisis. If people cannot pay their credit card bills, if they cannot pay their mortgages.
But you are not in the mainstream of views on this issue.
This, of course, just a snippet from the 15-plus minute interview. But we do want to talk today with a journalist who has covered what's going on here. Foster Kamer writes for the New York Observer. Foster, you are in our New York studio, and I know you recently wrote a piece for the Observer breaking down the different aspects of this controversy. I guess let me ask you this. When you started looking into this, what surprised you the most?
What surprised me the most was that it was Adam Davidson from Planet Money on NPR. You know, NPR and This American Life, which was the program that Planet Money was spawned from, are known for their very, very, very strict journalism and ethics standards. And Adam Davidson in the program seemed pretty unimpeachable. So to have this very, very generalist program that is very beloved come in conflict with ethics issues was a pretty big surprise.
Yeah, absolutely. But I noticed, Foster, that the title of your article was NPR Planet Money host Adam Davidson under fire from rogue media ethicists. It sounds a little sarcastic towards these journalists. I mean, have they gone rogue because they formed a website, or are you implying something else here?
The only kind of implication with rogue, and I kind of regret my choosing of the words there, is because these guys formed this project called the Shame Project, where they're taking on mainstream journalists, big names, like Arianna Huffington and Malcolm Gladwell, and exposing their conflicts of interests and things that people might not know about them with regards to their ethical quandaries. And they're not really mainstream, to put it lightly. They founded The Exile, this alternate weekly Russian publication that was a satirical publication. They're not with a mainstream outlet. So the word rogue was kind of chosen because they are very much on the outside shooting in. But they did a pretty good job surprising a lot of people, including myself, with this report.
Right, and I should tell you, we had them both on the show. Yasha Levine and Mark Ames were on the show just a few hours ago talking about it as well. But, of course, we wanted to talk to you as well because you wrote the article. Another controversy, Foster, surrounding Adam Davidson was that he took speaking gigs for events sponsored by big banks like Bank of America and J.P. Morgan. I know you actually reached out to NPR and the New York Times, who Davidson also contributes to. What did they tell you in terms of whether Davidson broke company rules?
They said that they did not in both instances. And both companies have vaguely worded policies regarding this. Essentially, it comes down to you wouldn't speak to somebody whose industry you could affect. And notably, the New York Times has let a few people off on this rule, like their tech columnist, who is a very widely read guy, and he's taken multiple speaking fees, and he's never really gotten in trouble. He has a very, very wide following. Whether or not this has something to do with that, the fact that he's never been impeached by the Times is anyone's guess, but according to the Times and NPR, they both said that Davidson's gigs were cleared before he actually took them, and therefore they abide by the journalistic ethics strictures that they post in their guidelines.
Foster, let's broaden this discussion a little bit. I mean, how does the public know? You know, the founders of the Shame website certainly came out with this information and put it out there on the interwebs about an incident and about, you know, for example, the interview happened almost 3 years ago. But how can the public know right away if what they're listening to, what they're watching, what they're reading could represent a journalistic conflict of interest?
Well, the only real way to know is if they're making these disclosures up front. And I believe NPR started doing this at the bottom of the show. The one time Planet Money reported on Ally Bank, the sponsor in question. But these disclosures need to be probably a little more towards the forefront, and they could be closer examined, and they just need to be made as visible as possible. So listeners can decide for themselves, really, if what they're being told is conflicted or not.
We're certainly getting into a tricky time as things change when it comes to, you know, the cable networks and, you know, internet journalism. And as much as we
unquestionably, this show is sponsored by Ally, so you know it's a sticky web that you get in once you start sorting out these conflicts.
Yeah, absolutely. And so many of us, you know, we like to think of journalism as a higher calling, but the bottom line is, and none of us are independently wealthy. We need somebody to pay the bills. It's a business. It requires advertisers. What do you think, Foster? I mean, how can there be a balance between keeping a journalistic outlet afloat and keeping it honest?
Well, first off, we should probably note that everybody has an asking price at the end of the day. I think all journalists like to think they're above this, but all journalists are in conflict in some way, to some degree, with what they're reporting on. And so the question is, how can you distance yourself from these outlets as you go about reporting on them? And there's really no perfect answer. The question might be to avoid reporting on them altogether. Paul Krugman, for example, doesn't take speaking gigs because he thinks it's ethically unsound. And so, you know, it really comes down to the readers choosing the publications and the media outlets they trust and making decisions about who they trust and who they don't. And alternately, these publications and media outlets making the best faith efforts to gain the trust of the readers and listeners and viewers by being as transparent as they can be. Because when something like this comes up and nobody knows about it, like anything else, when it's a surprise, it looks bad. In this case, whether or not there's a really, really deadly, awful conflict at the heart of what Adam Davidson is doing isn't actually going to be sussed out by anybody really besides Adam Davidson and NPR. But it looks bad because it is a surprise. And maybe the point is that readers and viewers and listeners should get less of these surprises.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know that if you ever watch NBC, for example, you know, half of that company is paid for by GE, General Electric. And anytime there's a recall or anytime they have to report on stock, they always mention before the story, at least, that, by the way, our parent company, GE, or our parent company, Comcast. So, you know, you do see that sometimes. Let's take this in a little bit of a different direction, Foster. Talk to me a little bit about what you're seeing now as somebody who sort of has, you know, their eyes and ears into what the new media is doing these days. What else concerns you other than the specific example of Adam Davidson and Planet Money?
You know, the disconcerting thing is really when certain media outlets take preference to the most read and beloved writers or columnists over others. Like Thomas P. Friedman has been busted for taking speaking gigs numerous times, and yet he wasn't fired. He's taken, David Pogue, for example, at the New York Times, has taken junkets, and he was not fired, whereas another writer who took a junket in the New York Times travel section, who had a cult following, but he wasn't as big as Friedman or as David Pogue, didn't get off. And so he got fired. And this kind of differentiation in standards is a really dangerous thing because it alludes to the idea of populism, and it alludes to the idea of, well, if they're succeeding to a certain level, then they can scrape by some of the ethics problems that others can't. And when it comes down to that's a pretty deadly practice for the future of journalism and the future of ethics in journalism.
Yeah, I think there's some good questions being raised both in your article and on the website, Shame. And we do appreciate having you on the show. Foster Kamer, senior editor for the New York Observer.
Thanks for having me.